Southampton is the largest city on the south coast of England, with a recorded population in 2010 of 250,000. It is a major port and particularly famous as the site where the mighty Titanic set sail in 1912. However, around 250 years ago, Southampton was an insignificant settlement unworthy of any significant reference or note. In fact, upon visiting it in 1724, Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, described the city as a place dying with age. So how did Southampton transition from the decaying town that Defoe described in early 18th century, with a population of merely 3,000, to a major city and a popular tourist site?
The 18th century saw the beginning of a trend which contemporary authors refer to as spa mania. Though the word spa originates from the name of a town in Belgium, the term came to define the towns or resorts which offered hydrotherapy such as cold or mineral water treatments. In 1668, a man called Thomas Godot decided to set up a medical practice in Bath, a city in the southwest of England.
So what drove this development, in your opinion?
The main driver of this development was the spas. In 1740, a spring of chalybeate water was discovered. Chalybeate water was essentially mineral spring water which contained salts of iron and was believed to have curative properties. This marks the beginning of Southampton's evolution into a spa town and ultimately its success as a city. The area where this spring water was discovered became the spa gardens and encouraged more and more fashionable society into Southampton. This helped the city prosper and develop. However, it also worsened social divisions, an issue which we will discuss later. Southampton was now able to attract royal visitors, such as King George II's son Frederick, Prince of Wales, in 1750.
So how does this look in reality?
From then on, Southampton flourished in consequence of this new discovery. It became a popular site for sea bathing in the 1760s and has several baths. The most well-known of these were Mr. Martin's baths, which was said to have been filled and emptied by the flow of the tide. With the rise of the spa town also led to the need for a dedicated space for socialising. Assembly rooms were used by the upper classes in the 18th and 19th centuries as somewhere to gather that was not a house. Often, the assembly rooms linked with spa towns like Southampton could hold hundreds of people for different balls, concerts, or simply informal gatherings. The assembly rooms in Southampton, which became known as the long rooms due to their shape, were completed by Mr. Martin, a Southampton local on the site adjoining his baths in 1761, and were designed to attract rich visitors to the spa. In 1771, Miss Constantina Orlebar wrote to the long rooms. The assembly room is near the baths and is a very elegant one, handsomely lighted up with 5 chandeliers, pretty pale stucco and looking glasses with papier-mâché decorations. New music gallery is on a proper level with the company. All the dancers pay a shilling to musicians. Gentlemen were scarce, as were beauties among the females. The assembly rooms were elegantly furnished with a ballroom, card room, dining saloons and a billiard room. They formed the focal point of key social activities in Southampton, such as weekly balls, with nightly balls taking place during race weeks by 1839. Places like the assembly rooms were crucial for the city's prosperity, as they were believed to attract what was considered to be the right sort of people.
What other social activities were available?
Yes, Southampton was also able to jump on the bandwagon of another innovation in England's social life, that is the Coffeehouse. First coffee houses were opened in London in 1650, and similar institutions had continued to be very popular ever since. Most of these coffee houses had a wide variety of newspapers and some had writing facilities. Both of these factors were vital in the success of Southampton as a spa town, as communication helped bring more and more people to the city. They would also play host to discussion groups or clubs. In 1698, a French traveller described the English coffee house thus: "You have all manner of news there. You have a good fire, which you may sit by as long as you please. You have a dish of coffee, you meet your friends for the transaction of business, and all for a penny, if you don't care to spend more." One example of a coffee house in Southampton was Coffee Room at George, which in 1813 John Feltham described as fitted up and well furnished with newspapers. The yearly subscription was £1 1s, non-subscribers 3p each time. Like the long rooms, coffee houses were a fashionable leisure spot for Southampton, which opened a wider cultural gap between the popular and the polite society, with different social classes socialising in different places.
And how did this affect the town's residents, in your view?
Yes, there was definitely an effect for the town's residents. Despite the provision of facilities enhanced the social life of those in the town, residents and tourists alike, strong class divisions remained. and in some cases were even cemented by development of the town and its architecture. A good example of this is the planned architectural development of the Polygon. The chief architect for this was Jacob Leroux, who was appointed in 1753. He began the design for the Polygon in the 1750s. The development aimed to provide an alternative to the long rooms that would allow for the upper classes to socialise away from the tradesmen, who, over time, had come to populate the long rooms. In the event, the Polygon was demolished after a few years. Nevertheless, the intentions behind the planned development serve to illustrate the very real class divisions present in the town at this time.
How can we determine the level of interest? How did the town itself react?
Well, it has been suggested that the increasing interest in Southampton as a town was what led to the publication of several guides to the town itself. And the first of these was produced in 1768. One of these guides, and it's one that's actually at the University of Southampton archives, was Sir Henry Englefield's Walk Through Southampton, published in 1801, and this describes historical buildings and highlights places of interest around the town. Englefield was actually a scientist as well as a student of antiquities, and devoted his entire life to study. This work is actually quite typical of him, because some of his other works were focused on particular areas or places of interest, such as the Isle of Wight and London Bridge. The popularity of this book is quite clear, as the author writes in the preface of the second edition that the first edition of the book was exhausted within a little more than 3 years. This popularity shows that there must have been a fairly wide interest in the town and its history, and the second edition was published 2 years later in 1803. As well as the history of Southampton, the book perhaps sheds some light on the attractions of Southampton to tourists, with one of them being its favourable climate. For example, he states that the whole town, though almost surrounded with water, enjoys the advantage of the dry situation. And as well as people from within England, the town also attracted foreign visitors, and one of these was the Swedish Count Kielmansegg, who visited Southampton from 1761 to 62. And he wrote in his diary of a journey to England, "Southampton is supposed to be one of the prettiest and healthiest country towns in England. It is rather extensive and well populated, and possesses several fine houses. Its situation close to the sea, which runs far into the land here, and the surrounding country make it an exceedingly pleasant place. The town has its own harbour of no great importance, however, and the trade is not extensive, being less than it might and ought to be. Many people come here every year, partly for sea bathing, partly by order of their physicians, who consider the air in Southampton to be the healthiest in all of England."
How popular was the town itself? Did it have a wide-ranging appeal?
The 1770s arguably marked the peak of Southampton's popularity. A guidebook written a little while after this time, in 1781, claimed that it is no wonder that the royal family show a predilection for this part of England, and no wonder that so many of the first families of the kingdom visit it annually, and ardently desire to possess at least a cottage in the region of politeness. Here are most of the conveniences and agreements of the town, without that perpetual thunder and clouds of smoke which blind and deafen those who have not quite lost their senses. Those who are fond of dancing may shine in the long rooms. The lovers of drama may frequent the playhouse, the jolly companions the inns, the politicians the coffeehouses, and those of the nautical genius may sail on the pleasantest water in Europe. But those who are more fond of instructive and entertaining company should resort to the circulating library, where they will find plenty of food for their mind and hear the news of the day and what is going on in the polite circle. It should be noted that this guidebook was written by Thomas Baker, first recorded in Southampton in 1767, who owned one of the circulating libraries in town. This was located at 142 High Street, along with the rest of his extensive business as a printer, publisher, bookseller, bookbinder, and a newspaper agent. Circulating libraries were often popular in resorts such as Southampton, and so it would have been in his best interest to present Southampton in a positive light. But this passage is nonetheless interesting in summing up the attractions of the spa town during this period.
How did the authorities react to this? How did the increase in tourism affect the city itself?
So, the increase in the number of visitors to Southampton meant, of course, that changes had to be made to the town itself. For instance, in terms of things like paving and lighting. So, one of the ways in which this was done was via the creation of improvement commissions. And these were a type of statutory body established to carry out these tasks, and they were usually set up by the passing of an Improvement Act in Parliament. So, for example, an Improvement Act was passed in Parliament in 1770 with the aim of extending lighting, but unfortunately the Improvement Commissioners weren't always effective initially. So, for example, although this Improvement Act was passed, the Commissioners didn't really do very much to extend lighting for over a decade after this.
What exactly were the powers of the Improvement Commissioners?
So when we consider the powers of improvement commissions in general throughout the country, their powers generally became broader over time, extending to cover areas of life such as planning permission as well as paving and lighting. So, for example, the first improvement commissions started appearing in the 17th century, and so the Southampton Improvement Commission was established quite a long time after this, with the 1770 Act allowing commissioners to regulate building encroachments onto the streets, among other things. For example, on the 9th of March 1795, planning permission was given to a Mr. Puckett, who applied for leave to erect a bow window at his house in the corner of Castle Lane, and the Commission ruled that it will not be any detriment to the public. As a general rule, Southampton's Improvement Commission concerned itself very extensively with paving, and it spent a few £1,000s on it per annum, and there was a very good reason for this. So one good example showing this is the fact that in 1773, one woman stepped into a pothole at the corner of the Butcher's Shambles that was at least 2 feet square and full of water at least 6 inches deep, and was splashed halfway up her legs when neatly dressed to pay a visit, to the no small diversion of the gentlemen of the Steel and other bears of the neighbourhood. The duties of Southampton's Improvement Commission eventually expanded to include the surveying of lamps, arranging the paying of repairing rates, and appointing a night watch, the last of these being something that we'll discuss a bit later in this podcast.
Large towns often have problems with crime. Did Southampton have any of these problems?
With more and more people coming to Southampton, it would have been very important to retain control over the public. As well as improvement commissioners, public nuisances were also regulated by the actions of the court leet. The court leet tried and punished crimes of a more minor nature committed in its jurisdiction, and trials took place a few times each year. These trials were held in the Guildhall from 1670, which at the time was located in the Bargate. The court leet had the power to find minor offences and to appoint minor borough officials. The record of Southampton's court leet can also give us an insight into the leisure pursuits of the inhabitants of Southampton. For example, the records of the court leet from 1761 record that on the 14th of April, one of Southampton's residents was fined for providing a variety of games such as roly and poly and shuffleballs at Ninepins Alley. The court leet to this day is still held, but in a much reduced role. It only meets once a year in the council chamber in the civic centre. As not all of Southampton's residents lived up to the images of Spartan that the royal visitors loved. In particular, the smaller alleys outside the jurisdiction of the commissioners proved a problem. For instance, in the Hampshire Chronicle on 27 September 1773, it was reported that last Thursday evening, a young gentleman, who was a stranger here, attempted to go from his lodgings in his mask, dressed in the character of a shepherd. The mob insulted him greatly by throwing him down and tossing him like a football for some time, and in all probability would soon have put an end to his life had not some humane persons interposed. This was followed by an incident in 1784, where the mayor was robbed by a highwayman while returning home with his daughter in a chaise and four. Although a night watch was re-established in 1788, the commission was only able to engage a head watchman and 4 others owing to a lack of applicants. In 1792, the minutes of the commission reported that 3 of the 4 were frequently in liquor, aka drunk, when on duty, and the head watchman was allowed to change their rounds. A. Temple Patterson argued in A History of Southampton 1700 to 1914 that this may have been intended to reduce the access to beer houses and taverns where they could get free drinks. Cases such as this highlight the problems faced by the town. There were ongoing tensions between residents and visitors, and with residents resenting visitors and using them more or less for, I guess, a bit of fun and as people to take advantage of.
Overall, how would you evaluate the changes in the town?
So I would say that one good way of evaluating the changes in Southampton is by comparing maps that were made of the town. So for example, If you compare the 1846 Ordnance Survey map of Southampton, which was the first really detailed map of Southampton, with Taylor's 1759 map of Hampshire, the results are actually quite startling. So Taylor's Southampton consisted of a cluster of buildings based around the port and the old medieval quarter of the city. Some areas which today are well-established suburbs of the city, such as North and South Stoneham, Bitton and Chandler's Ford, were only rural parishes. Many other areas such as Portswood, Highfield and Shirley are simply not there. The same principle applied to some of what are today the town's major thoroughfares, such as above Bar Street. The town's single church, St Mary's, stood in virtual isolation to the north, a victor of the westward movement of the town in the medieval period. By contrast, if you look at the 1846 Ordnance Survey map, it shows a Southampton that had spread well beyond its medieval walls. It had even swallowed up St Mary's and was spreading up towards what is today the Southampton suburb of Northam. Further up the map are the earliest incarnations of modern Southampton suburbs such as Portswood. Many of these areas didn't even exist 150 years earlier. In addition, buildings now existed both above and below the Bargate, where 100 years before there had been nothing but fields and marshes. These buildings included the churches of All Saints, St Lawrence and Holyrood.
In June 1841, the first comprehensive survey was taken of the UK's population, and the results confirm what the maps have already told us. On the night of the 6th of June, 1841, 27,000 people were recorded as being in the Southampton area, an almost tenfold increase since 1700. Above Bar Street, which before the 18th century simply did not exist, had become a centre of enterprise and the professional trades. The street's residents included several innkeepers, an auctioneer, and people whom the census identified as living through independent means. Almost a third of those were not born in the county, quite a feat given that the boundaries were nowhere nearby. The reality is that many of these individuals would not have had the jobs they had if the Spa had not created new opportunities. Quite frankly, many of them would probably not have been in Southampton at all had this incentive not been present. When one compares these maps alongside the census and other historical data, it is clear that the town had gone from being a failing port trapped within its medieval walls to being a thriving early city, which was quickly swallowing up the surrounding countryside, including what had previously been small villages and hamlets. Indeed, Southampton Terminus railway station was built amongst herds of grazing cattle and sheep. This growth was made possible through the economic and social revival that the Spa brought to Southampton. It might please you to know that the building today is used as a waterfront casino. Although the Spa period was a relatively short one for Southampton, it was one which caused a revival and an expansion of the city, and which created the legacy the city still lives with today.